Hello, Malik Currington here, Family Budget Fisherman. Welcome to another episode. I hope that you all enjoy it. Happy New Year to all of you who are there, and I hope that you are beginning your new year with a great chance to catch your personal best this year while trying to save as much money as you possibly can. As you read in the description and also in the thumbnail, I'm talking about two particular fishing techniques that are essentially crappie techniques and have crossed over into bass fishing some years ago. I'd say with the drop shot, we're probably going back maybe 15 years in particular. When we're talking about getting involved, they've always drop shotting of one aspect or another has been around for decades, and it has caught bass for decades. But I'm talking about in terms of the current commercial environment we're in, where the tournaments were driving, where the major thrust of sales of bait and tackle. We're talking probably about 10 to 15 years ago with the drop shot. Also, because that's where in the late 90s, early 2000s is when you started getting innovations in plastic. Plastic used to be much more rigid before now, and being able to throw plastic in cold water was a big thing because plastic don't do well in cold water, generally speaking. And so the two techniques that I'm referring are number one, the drop shot here, and we usually have a weight on it. You have the drop shot weight on it. You probably can't see that from here, but you know what I'm talking about. It's a drop shot weight, and so you have the drop. So you have it, and you fish it at different depths. You can rig it so that it's about a couple inches off the ground. You can go all the way up to 2-3 feet. Doesn't matter. Drop shots are thrown that way. I guess the Tokyo rig is kind of innovated at the lower end level of this, which I think is kind of an interesting deal that you got this wired thing hanging down below your bait. But hey, if it catch fish, it catch fish. And then of course the other one is the float and fly. And if you're interested, just as an aside, in the terminal tackle that you see here, I'm going to be doing a video on the terminal tackle itself, in the later episodes. So don't worry about it if I'm not explaining in any detail the terminal connections, the terminal tackle that you see set up here. I promise you, I will go into detail about the terminal tackle. But needless to say, just dealing with the rigs itself. So you have a float and fly here, and you could rig it, with one of the bass flies that are for sale. Usually, you can get some deals on them, but they're usually on the more expensive side. Even if you say, well, they're only 75 cents a pop. Well, I don't know if you all remember getting crappie jigs, like this. You get crappie jigs for as little as 15-20 cents. Now you could probably get them now. I guess you can get a card for 10 for maybe $2.50, I think, or $3. But it's certainly, if you're paying 25 or 30 cents for a 16th ounce marabou jig head versus paying 75 cents for a very similar lure, this isn't even an issue of doing discounts. This is an issue of just practicality. So a lot of the float and fly rigs will mention, if you go and look online, they'll say, well, typically that rod is over 8 feet. So you're probably looking at, in many cases, I saw 9.5 feet long, some as long as 10. I have personally, for my crappie fishing, I have 12-foot rods here. I got 12-foot rods. And the 12-foot rods, I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but it's a 12-foot medium. What is this? Medium light. Um, yeah, light action rod. This is made by Shakespeare. 2 pieces. Each piece is 6 feet. And then I have an Akuma Stratus wood fins 215 here with a 15-pound fluorocarbon leader and a snap on it. Well, and I've done quite well over the years with that bait. I've done very well, as a matter of fact. The point here is that this is a money-saving observation for you to consider what's already in your arsenal before you consider making purchases for that particular technique of fishing. And the reason why this becomes so apropos during this time period is because during this time, cold weather, for those of you who are bass fishing, you'll get out there and you'll look at some of these cold water applications where the drop shot and the float and fly happen to take a premier application preference over some of the older ones, like like using the darter heads and cold water cranking and using bass jigs with living skirts. It's kind of taken over those areas. Now, it might be because of the diversity of styles and perspectives how you could approach the water, but needless to say, whoever did the innovation took a look at other fish forages and how they were being fished for and said, hey, that needs to be adopted for the bass industry. Number one, because it gives fishermen more diversity in their applications and they can get out during the winter and catch some of these big fish, because everyone will tell you who's fished regularly in winter for bass, your biggest bass might just come from winter fishing of some sort. But also because they need to be able to sell you something. Quite frankly, how many spinnerbaits can you buy? How many crankbaits are you willing to buy? Because there's a point where the signature applications of spinnerbait or reaction baits in general, so your chatterbaits, your crankbaits, your spinnerbaits, your buzz baits, your topwater baits, and your stick baits for topwater, and even some of your propeller signature baits. At some point, there's an overlap where you don't have with the diversity of plastic baits and certainly the drop shot versus the float and fly is definitely different signatures. There's different applications for that same fish during the wintertime. During the spring and summer, you have more options just the same, because you do have the spinner bait and the crankbait and the topwater bait fishing. And I'm saying this in general because in tidal waters, bass have to be treated more like fall bass, summer and fall bass than they do winter bass, because they have to keep moving no matter what. That water's going to move in a tidal fishery, and it's going to move that fish whether it's in the spring, winter, summer, or fall. He's got to learn how to move. Now, in lakes, they don't have to move as much. They get down in that mud and they sit there, unless the lake is turning over, and then they adjust. The only other exception is when the food move, I move. Plain and simple. When the food move, I move. So take a look at your arsenal and see what you have. Take a look at other applications of fishing in other areas. So look at the saltwater guys. The saltwater guys will sometimes have a rig that looks like a float and fly, but obviously it's not, because this is probably a 25-pound ball or something like that, or at the very least, they're throwing major weight down there. But they'll have a leader that'll have 3 or 4 of these flies, these shrimp flies on them, going after rockfish. Take a look at what other fish forage. Take a look at what other fishing applications for other fish, besides bass, and to a certain extent besides crappie, and see how successful they are, and bring those applications into your area of bass fishing. Do me a favor, as a matter of fact. If you've already done something like that, tell me in the comments below the different ways that you have caught bass that was not a specific bass fishing application. Maybe you were going for carp and you had bait balls, you had bread balls, and you were catching bass with that. Interestingly enough, I went catfishing with someone, and I had jig hooks, bass jig hooks, and he had specific catfish rigs. And I told him, I said, you can catch just as much if you have a 1/2 ounce jig head and you put your bait on it and throw it out there. I've actually used bass. I've caught catfish that way. I've actually caught catfish on gulp baits as well because of the scent of the gulp baits when I specifically targeted them with the gulp baits. But on the other side, I've caught bass on trout. So this is a crappie jig with a trout worm on it, and I've used this for bass. I've done that before. I love to catch bass on crappie jigs. Here's a paddle tail that I've used. I obviously throw it this way, but this is a paddle tail that I like to throw, and I have one of a lot of those that I throw just the same. I've shown you. I haven't shown you, but here are my. These are flies used for trout. So I've thrown that. This actually is a striper fly that can be used for bass. And then here are some of the smaller ones. Hope you can see those there. That one's got some striper hair on it. Now I didn't catch monster-sized bass, but this fly in particular, I'll give you a nice little story about it. My dad and I are fishing, and we're floating past a dead fish that had not flies all over it, but it had bees all over it. And I told my dad, I said, we need to stop because the bluegill are on the top, but there's got to be bigger fish below that fish because it was just attracting the entire hierarchy, or food pyramid. So I broke out with this and I started catching a bunch of bluegill. Then the bluegill got bigger. And then for whatever reason, those bass, and I'm saying, I think the biggest one was 2 pounds. Most of them were keepers, but there was a couple 2-pounders that were in there that were targeting the bees. And so this application became real nice because they were targeting the bees. And so you can do that. And this is a lot less expensive. Now, I want you to also imagine, I remember just recently, Tim Little was talking about this. Tim Little from Tactical Bassin was talking about taking the floating fly and fishing it at the bottom because, like a jig, you can throw those floating flies, and some of them are weighted, and they go on down. Well, I want you to also remember you could do the same thing with actual flies for trout, and throw those flies, and they will go down there, and they look like small crayfish, they look like bait fish, they do all the same things, and you could do extremely well with those. I could sit here and just go on and on and on the subject, but I think you've gotten the concept here that you don't have to follow the model of waiting for a new bass lure. Understand that especially because of our past experiences in 2020 and experiences we're going to continue to live through in 2021, there's a lot more pressure on the water for the same group of fish. And if we're all throwing the same bait, we're all throwing Kitex, we're all throwing underspins and spinner baits and crankbaits. If we're all throwing the same bait, because remember, all these companies, whether it's 6 Sense, 13 Fishing, the Googans, Pure Fishing, which includes Berkeley and a whole mass of others, Strike King Lures. Everybody wants to sell you all the lures they produce. And if we're all buying all the lures that they produce and we're all getting bit at some point because we're catching and releasing, these fish develop a memory. And they remember that kind of stuff. Most of it is short term, but a lot of it is long term. They remember that kind of stuff. And so you get this kind of pressure where you need to do something really different. And I mean really different. And that's where this kind of thing comes in. Understand the drop shot and the float and fly, great techniques. However, take a look at what you have in your arsenal and see how you can apply those in a lot more simple ways. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. This is one of my more recent crappie jig rigs right here. Right here. So I have a little flat-tailed jig here with a 1/16 ounce. And then I have a 1.5 inch tube. And you better believe I put some crappie in the skillet. Threw back some bass. And I think we got the big bluegill, because the wintertime is real good for big bluegill and red ear as well. We also call them shell crackers. So once again, don't do anything unnecessary to break your family's budget trying to buy all this fishing equipment, but do everything you can to break your personal best. You all have a great time out there on the water. Till I see you again. Take care.